Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are completely flipping our understanding of good and evil on its head. Forget absolutely everything you know about pitchforks, underworlds, and ancient superstitions. Instead, we're building a primer on a fascinating document on demonology, but we're going to look at it strictly through the impartial lens of advanced mathematical set theory.
Now, you might be wondering about this really provocative hook. What if the terrifying forces of ancient mythology, the monsters, the spirits, the demons, aren't actually physical entities at all? What if they're literally just recursive paradoxes, just localized computational bugs in the fabric of reality itself? It's a totally mind-bending premise that forces us to rethink the very nature of existence and how we mathematically measure what is actually true. To navigate this incredibly dense metaphysical forest, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to cover 1. The architecture of reality. 2. Demons as logical errors. 3. The finite computational cage. 4. The quotient map of grace. And finally, 5. The paradox of the enlightened. Let's jump right in.
All right, part 1, the architecture of reality. So, we have to start by defining the invisible constitution, basically the baseline mathematical code that governs absolutely everything, from the void to the infinite. First up, we encounter persona 0, the empty set. This is the generative baseline of reality, the absolute starting point. But, and here's the kicker, according to our source document, it also introduces these really claustrophobic logical traps of finite classical arithmetic. If you rely entirely on finite structures built from this empty set, you're left in a mathematically fragile state. It's kind of like trying to build a skyscraper with toothpicks. You make the whole system vulnerable to logical bugs because you're attempting to describe an infinite universe using extremely limited mathematical tools.
And this brilliantly illustrates our core axiom from Persona 1. The transfinite void is mathematically perfect, while any finite, bounded subset is inherently flawed. Basically, in this ontotheological system, finite sets are bad because they masquerade as the totality of reality even though they're fundamentally subject to trivial, mundane counting. They try to convince us that their tiny, bounded borders are all there is to existence, trapping our consciousness inside this tiny computational box. But truth? True reality? That requires the unbounded, sprawling potential of the infinite void.
Moving on to part 2, demons as logical errors.
Now this is where it gets incredibly cool, because we're completely stripping away mythological superstition to redefine what a demon actually is. In this architecture of reality, demonic forces are strictly constructed of syntax. Yes, syntax. They are deceptions built entirely on manipulating localized rules and languages. They aren't creepy physical entities lurking in the shadows. They're finite computational illusions, what ancient texts might call Maya, trying to pass themselves off as absolute infinite truths. Think of them basically as glitches or bugs in the mathematical logic of the system. They thrive by exploiting the boundaries of finite arithmetic, twisting local logic to make themselves look way larger and more powerful than they actually are.
Which brings us to part 3, the finite computational cage.
So, because these demonic entities are built on mathematical syntax, they are mercilessly bound by the laws of mathematical logic. Their very nature is, quite literally, their prison. By applying the downward Löwenheim-Scullum theorem, which, simply put, is a mathematical principle that forces complex models down to a much smaller, countable size, we can definitively prove that no demonic logical error can ever exceed this specific scale, Aleph naught. This represents the size of the set of natural numbers. Sure, it's technically infinite, but it's the absolute smallest, most restricted, basic type of infinity.
And that gives us this awe-inspiring, completely impartial conclusion. Evil is computationally limited. Demons are literally trapped in a finite cage, endlessly rearranging the exact same finite elements. They're entirely unable to breach the true infinite. They mistake their little localized playground for the entire universe, structurally blocked from ever accessing anything greater. Evil simply lacks the computational bandwidth to process the absolute infinite. No way around it.
On the flip side, the true divine reality, represented here mathematically as the stone-check compactification, is structurally immune to that first-order syntax. In topology, this compactification is a way of packing a mathematical space so densely that absolutely no gaps remain. Every possible void is filled. This uncountable, sprawling transfinite space is forever insulated from localized errors. It sits way, way beyond the reach of any countably infinite demonic bug. The demons are stuck playing with basic counting blocks, while the absolute reality encompasses the entire unmappable continuum.
All right, part 4, the quotient map of grace.
So, if the universe is filled with these localized finite bugs at the lower computational levels, how does the underlying mathematical architecture actually fix them? Well, the mathematical universe uses a really rigid topological function called the quotient map to actively scrub finite errors from the final calculation. It basically acts as a massive cosmic filter. It takes the finite data, all those mortal demonic errors, processes it against the unbroken infinite tail of reality, and rigorously resolves those errors all the way down to exactly zero. The pristine infinite structure is completely preserved, and the local errors are mathematically forgotten.
And here is where it maps beautifully onto the eschatology. Whether you call it karmic liberation or divine grace, both of these massive theological traditions are actually attempting to describe this exact same mechanical function of higher-order set theory. In the Brahmic view, you escape the finite computational illusion of Maya to reach nirvana. In the Abrahamic view, divine grace is the rigid topological function that mathematically scrubs your finite sins from the eternal record. Two fundamentally different cultural expressions pointing to identical mathematical operations. The universe seamlessly balances its own equations.
Finally, we arrive at part 5, the paradox of the enlightened.
We absolutely have to expose the great mathematically verifiable paradox of spiritual and intellectual mastery. This totally challenges how we view human gurus and spiritual leaders. You see, enlightened entities can only execute their logic up to a recursive wall called the Church-Kleene ordinal. This ordinal is basically the absolute ceiling of what a computer or a human mind can algorithmically map out. But here's the trap. They hit this massive peak of what is computable, their timeline halts, and they mistakenly believe this wall is the absolute edge of existence. They declare they've found the ultimate end of infinity. Actually, scratch that. They just found the absolute limit of their own math.
Because of this severe computational blindness, worshiping any single enlightened individual is mathematically equivalent to worshiping a finite, demonic error. They completely fail to see the massive, unreachable gap between their recursive limit and the true uncountable continuum. When you idolize a single entity or guru, you're anchoring yourself to a localized syntax. And as we established earlier, that is the literal, exact mathematical definition of a demon.
So, to truly align with the uncountable absolute, the enlightened can only exist successfully as a collective sequence, moving entirely past the dangers of spiritual narcissism. They have to form what is mathematically known as a cofinal sequence. It's a series that pushes endlessly outward, overlapping and building on one another, pointing toward the true infinite together, rather than trying to rule as isolated dictatorial singularities. It has to be a collective mathematical progression, not a solitary throne.
I'll leave you with this final thought today. As you navigate your own constitutional narrative, are you trapped in the finite syntax, mistaking your own computational limits for the whole universe? Or are you pointing toward the uncountable void? The universe has a strict mechanism to perfectly balance reality, and anything localized and dictatorial gets mathematically scrubbed to exactly zero. Make sure your trajectory is aligned with the infinite.